Wamraka Moses yan wala ye pone ye buj ngara bura fera yumanaya.
It's long been established that many Aboriginal people in remote communities live in the kind of overcrowded conditions you'd expect to see in the third world.
It's not good enough people. There's three old people we got there. They're pensioners, couple of them on dialysis, and they live in rough. They shouldn't be in there at all. This is too rough.
Australia, the land of opportunity, the land of the fair go. Australia, where over 1 million people are living in chronic deprivation. Among this population are Indigenous Australians, and are in fact more likely to experience severe disadvantage. In comparison to non-Indigenous Australians, there are clear disparities surrounding Indigenous health, education, housing and employment levels, to name a few. Our neighbours also face a vast amount of inequalities that aren't generally experienced by us to the same extent, including discrimination, racism and stigma, and this attitude has evidently worked its way through government policies and the like. This in itself presents as a boundary to opportunities and can heavily impede the next. Who is to blame? While some may argue it is due to individual choices and actions, on the other we have broader structural causes. However, putting the blame aside, the real question is, are we doing enough to alleviate these disadvantages? Are we really looking at this issue from all perspectives? Let's take a further look into Aboriginal Australia and the current inequities they face.
Indigenous people are the original inhabitants of Australia before European colonisation. The population of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders around 1788 is thought to be anywhere between 314,000 to 400,000 before British made contact. These figures rapidly declined though due to diseases, war and loss of land after colonisation. Currently, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders represent only 3% or 714,000 of Australia's population. Breaking down further, the Indigenous people as a society group highlights reasons why they are considered a high-risk group for experiencing poverty. The Australian Bureau of Statistics shows that in June 2014, half of the Indigenous population was aged 22 years or under, where the average age of the other Australians was 37 years or under. Ongoing low life expectancies for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders explain why just 4% were aged 65 and over. An Indigenous male's life expectancy is only 69.1 years and a slightly improved 73.7 years for women. Helping explain also why 52% of Indigenous people aged 50 to 74 and 58% of those aged 75 and over are women. These figures give some explanation as to why Indigenous people are overrepresented amongst people receiving benefits like parenting payments and youth allowance. The 2011 Household Income and Labour Dynamics in Australia survey found that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were twice as more likely to experience poverty than any other Australians. It was recorded in 2014 that 19.3% of Indigenous people were currently living below the poverty line, compared to only 12.4% of other Australians. This figure is shocking when you consider again that Indigenous people only represent 3% of the Australian society. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Health Survey also showed that in 2012 to 2013, the overall unemployment rate of Indigenous people of working age was a very high 21.1%, when compared to the general unemployment rate of 5.7%. This means that Indigenous people during this period were 4 times as more likely to be unemployed than any other Australian. It is no wonder that Indigenous people are disproportionately represented amongst people accessing support payments. Government data from March 2014 shows that the Indigenous represent 8.8% of people receiving New Start allowance, 12.5% of those currently receiving parenting payments, and 15.9% of all people accessing youth allowance.
Indigenous Australians experience inequality every day. These inequalities often lead to life in poverty and impact on their lives and opportunities. Three major inequalities they experience compared to non-Indigenous Australians include poorer health and lower levels of education and employment. One inequality and disadvantage can spiral into many others. Without adequate education, this causes further inequalities in health and employment. Being disadvantaged in these areas together cause detriments to individuals and families' social, emotional and physical health and well-being. It is important to realise that their lives and opportunities are often impacted by deeper underlying issues that influence the inequality this group experiences. Violence, alcohol, illicit drugs, mental health issues and childhood trauma are all prevalent in many Indigenous communities and are often consequences from intergenerational trauma from their families and communities' unjust past. The inequalities previously experienced by this group continue on into future generations and still impacts them in everyday living. Information from the GAP Indigenous Disadvantage in Australia website gives statistics that highlight the difference in opportunities between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. The proportion of Indigenous 20 to 24-year-olds completing Year 12 or equivalent was 59% in 2012 to 13, compared with 86 to 88% for non-Indigenous Australians. This is a clear inequality this group faces and impacts opportunities in economic participation, income and health. Without sufficient education, this group lacks opportunities to learn about health risk behaviours and preventative service use, as well as social participation and crime and justice. It is clear that one inequality and lack of opportunity can lead into another. In 2012 to 2013, Indigenous Australians were 4 times more likely to be hospitalised for chronic health conditions compared with non-Indigenous Australians. This is not only a disadvantage in itself that many Indigenous Australians experience, but also can impact on their employment and education prospects. This disadvantage can limit or stop individuals gaining employment or participating in education programs. Lastly, geographic location is an inequality some Indigenous Australians face. Adequate resources and facilities are not provided for many rural and remote communities, and this limits their opportunities in accessing education, employment, and health facilities.
One explanation for why Aboriginal Australians are affected by poverty and inequality is the individual explanation. This view basically states that people are in poverty as a result of their own choices and behaviours, and that Aboriginal people living in poverty are somehow lazy, uneducated or inferior in comparison to the rest of the Australian population. According to Gregory Jordan, the individual explanation of poverty suggests that individuals create, sustain and transmit to future generations a culture that reinforces the various social and behavioural deficiencies. Their individual choices and attitudes to various aspects of life, including work and family, is said to create a culture that perpetuates inequality and poverty. In 2001, the number of Aboriginal people participating in the labour force was just 55.9%, compared to 76.4% of non-Indigenous Australians. This statistic is directly related to the number of young people finishing Year 12, which is only 35.9% of people who identify as Aboriginal. These factors, along with the increased rates of divorced single-parent families, teen pregnancy, drug and alcohol abuse, and participation in criminal activity, is said to reflect the dysfunctional values held by these Aboriginal Australians. This explanation also indicates that welfare is a big part of the problem. Providing cash payments to Aboriginal communities creates incentive not to work and keeps them dependent on a system of charity while not contributing to society. Porter and Tyrese in 2006 explained that the gradual loss of self-reliance is at the core of poverty. This argument has traditionally been taken on by right-wing governments, as it alleviates their responsibility and turns blame onto the Aboriginal population themselves. Aboriginal Australians can be affected by these ideas not just in material living conditions, but also in terms of isolation, self-blame, lack of confidence, and the shame attached to poverty and inequality.
Another widely accepted explanation for the inequality and poverty experienced by Indigenous Australians is the structural explanation. This point of view argues that poverty can be traced back to structural factors inherent to either the economy or to several interrelated institutional environments that serve to favour certain groups over others. In terms of applying this theory to Aboriginals, we only need to look at the history and institutional racism that reinforces and sustains barriers that stop Aboriginal people from shedding the adaptations made by them to survive in a system stacked against them. When European values were first imposed upon Aboriginal people, they lost spiritual and cultural heritage as well as contact with their land and traditions, ultimately leading to the loss of identity through oppression. The impact of this is still relevant today and is reflected in unemployment rates, health statistics, access to housing and educational participation. Access to education, for which many remote Aboriginal communities is quite low, is a main influence on poverty and inequality. Coupled with any cognitive and behavioural problems these children suffer from, it can be difficult to finish school and in turn find work. Structural poverty impacts Indigenous Australians in terms of suffering from discrimination in the workforce or just in the community as well. Another example of the way structural inequality impacts the Indigenous is the tax system. According to Porter and Terry, the tax system is supposed to be a mechanism that will redistribute wealth evenly, but it is increasingly becoming an impediment to poverty reduction. Through tax minimisation and cheating, the rich get richer and the community is denied access to money that could be used for any number of projects. The goods and services tax is an example of this. The flat rate of 10% is obviously going to impact poorer families more. Structural inequality has been reflected in government policy for hundreds of years, beginning with the dispossession of land, forced relocation and forced removal of children, and has continued up until the more recent Closing the Gap initiative handed down by the 2007 government, in which, among ill-designed programs and ineffective education, it clearly lacks a deeper understanding and consultation with the Aboriginal community.
One social security benefit relevant to Indigenous Australians is AB Study from Centrelink. It assists with costs for those who are either studying or undertaking an Australian apprenticeship. Eligibility requirements include being either an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander Australian, meeting Australian residency requisites, being enrolled in an approved course or doing a full-time Australian apprenticeship, and not being awarded any other government assistance to either study or accomplish an apprenticeship. The intention for the payment is to assist with costs for education, accommodation and living, travel fares, and prescription medicine. The amount of payment varies and is dependent upon your study load and age. If you're a student living away from home, your rate of payment can also increase. For example, if you're a student less than 16 years old in tertiary education, the maximum fortnightly payment is $32.20. However, if you're a student 22 years and older, the maximum fortnightly payment increases to $519.20. Qualifying for an AB Study payment also gives you the possibility to be entitled to many other payments and benefits, including crisis payments, income support bonuses, relocation scholarships, rent assistance, and sickness allowance. This payment substantially helps to reduce poverty for some Indigenous Australians, as it gives people the opportunity to study or undertake an apprenticeship that previously may not have had the resources available. This leads to stronger and better employment opportunities in the future, and also results in more financial stability. This payment does, however, take a very individualistic outlook on poverty and assumes that to alleviate poverty surrounding all Indigenous Australians, people should study or undertake an apprenticeship so that they can get employment. It does not account for families or individuals that are unable to study or undertake an apprenticeship for various reasons, such as having the time to fully commit. It also ensures that this payment can be ceased once study is completed to ensure that people do not become welfare dependent. From the Department of Human Services, 2015.
We can conclude that Indigenous Australians suffer greatly despite the advantages that most Australians take for granted. It's unfair that one specific group is othered, excluded, and unable to participate fully within the wider community. I advise you all to ask yourselves why. Why is this happening and why is there so much difference in opportunity? In fact, are we still the land of opportunity, the land of the fair go?